Well, good morning, and it's lovely to be able to share with you on this last Sunday before Christmas, a time when here in Jersey we're in the midst of experiencing a very different Christmas due to the effects of coronavirus around us on the island. And COVID-19 has meant, hasn't it, that this year all of us have not been able to experience the presence of other people in the usual way. Friends or family may not have been able to visit from off island, and we may not have been able to get to the UK or elsewhere in the world to visit them. For those who are vulnerable or shielding or simply wary, having stayed at home more than usual, they haven't mixed with others as they might normally do. Even at church at various points during the course of this year, even this coming Sunday, today, we're not able to physically gather, to be physically present as a church family. And absence can be hard, can't it? The lack of physical touch, a simple handshake or an arm around a shoulder or a hug can take its toll. And whilst some of us are able to be digitally present on screen with others, it's not the same as being physically together. Bethany, our eldest daughter, returned home from university 2 weeks ago, where because of shielding, she'd actually spent the last 77 days in one room in her student house. She was present in the same house as two other friends, but physically absent from contact. A lonely time. And when she came out of her prescribed 10-day isolation here at home on Tuesday evening, she experienced her first hug, her first experience of any physical touch in over 3 months. I don't share that for any sympathy, it's just the reality for many people over the course of this strange year. And as Christmas is just around the corner, we're not going to have the presence of people around us in the way we might normally have this Christmas. Limitations on gatherings and the numbers we can gather with will accentuate the absence of friends and family for many of us. Which I think is why the heart of Christmas is so important for us to hold on to this year. The reality of God with us. You see, this Christmas we may not have the presence of people with you, but we can all have the presence of God with us because of Jesus. It's the truth that Matthew shares with us in chapter 1 of his Gospel, where he describes the birth of Jesus. And he says this in verse 22. All this took place to fulfill what the Lord had said through the prophet. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and they will call him Emmanuel, which means God with us. And if we look at that passage from Matthew that we read just a few moments ago, we see a man, Joseph, who on hearing that his wife-to-be is pregnant and that he's not the father, wants to make himself absent from the scene. An absent father, even if he does it discreetly. Yet an angel appears and tells him that he must welcome Mary not only into his home but as his wife, to welcome her presence and in the most intimate way. The context of these very human dynamics between Joseph and Mary is actually one of conflict between being present and absent. And it's into this confusion that Jesus is born, God very much with them. It's a profound truth that in the birth of Jesus, God himself becomes physically present with us. And this truth shows us that God is not an absent God. He's a God who's right alongside us in the reality of our daily lives. The famous words of John chapter 1, often read before Christmas, describe the coming of Jesus in this way. The Word, who from the beginning is God and who made all things, this Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The Message paraphrases it like this. The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighbourhood. The implication being that in Jesus, God is right alongside us in all the complexities of our daily lives. We see that in the first Christmas, don't we? A teenage pregnancy with an illegitimate baby. Nowhere to stay, far from home, and so the baby is put in an animal trough in the dirt of a stable. There's a rush to flee the country in fear for life and trying to survive as refugees in a foreign land. And it's into that confusion and mess that God comes. Don't we need to know that today? This Christmas? Where we may be confused because so much is different. Where things do seem a bit of a mess around us, to be honest. Where we feel we don't understand and maybe feel just too tired to keep going. The coming of Jesus shows that God is with us, right alongside us, right where we are. And so it also means he's not a distant God. He understands. He understands what it's like to be human in all its joys and in all its pains. Philippians chapter 2 says this, that Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage, but rather he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, and being made in human likeness. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. You see, Jesus shared our flesh and blood, as Hebrews 2 puts it, experiencing all it is to be us. And so he knows what it is to experience what many of us may feel this Christmas: uncertainty, vulnerability, disappointment, loneliness. Philippians 2 ends there with the words, he became obedient to death, even death on a cross. Because through his life and even his death, Jesus experienced every emotion known to us, whatever our lives are like this Christmas. Separation, anxiety, rejection, no home, grief, loss, misunderstanding, injustice, betrayal, unfairness, pain, illness, suffering, even death itself. The coming of Jesus shows us that God is with us, that he understands everything we're experiencing in our lives, even this Christmas, that we don't hold these things alone. And yet the reality of God with us doesn't stop there. If it did, then, oh yes, it would provide comfort, but it wouldn't provide hope. Because hope comes from the fact that Jesus came to redeem, to take our lives and to bring about change, positive change. In the big picture we've thought about already in this series of our relationship with God and how Jesus came to restore what's been lost and to redeem it. Well, Jesus can, because he's God with us. There's a story told of a Scottish farmer who didn't believe in the Christmas story. He thought the idea that God would become a man was just simply absurd. His wife, however, believed and raised their children with such belief. But the father would often mock her and make fun of her faith. It's nonsense, he'd say. Why would God lower himself to become like us? On one snowy evening before Christmas, his wife took the children to church and the farmer stayed at home. Over the next few hours, the weather deteriorated and there was a huge snowstorm that swept in. He heard a loud thump against the window and then another thump and went outside to see what was going on. And there in the field was the strangest sight, a flock of geese. They'd been migrating south but had got lost in the storm, and they were now stranded on his farm. The farmer had compassion on them. He wanted to help them. He realised that his barn could give them some shelter, so he opened the doors and he stood back hoping they'd go into the warmth. But they just stood there and looked at him. He tried to shoo the geese in, but all that did was send them in lots of different directions. So perplexed, he went inside, he got some bread, and he made a trail to the barn door. One or two were interested and then stopped eating. Nothing he seemed to be able to do would get them into the barn, into the safety of that dry space. So feeling very frustrated, he said, "What can I do? Why don't they follow me? Can't they see that the only safe place to be is inside this barn?" He thought for a moment and then realised that they wouldn't follow him as a man. The only way that he would be able to save them is if he became a goose. If only he became like one of them, he thought. And then they would follow him into the barn. And at that moment he stopped and realised what he'd said. If only I could become like one of them, then I could save them. And for the first time he began to understand the heart of God at Christmas. Romans 1 tells us, the other reading we had this morning, that God is both fully man and fully God. Because he's fully human, he can take our place on the cross to put right all our wrong. And because he's fully God, God with us, he can break the power of sin and death and restore us to life. And in the smaller picture of our day-to-day lives, he too redeems. Yes, he's alongside. Yes, he understands. But yes, he can transform. As Bear Grylls puts it in his daily devotional book called Soul Food, he says Jesus doesn't always respond to our personal storms in the same way. Sometimes he calms them, just as he did for the disciples when he calmed the storm on the lake. But sometimes he lets the wind and the waves continue to rage, while he chooses to calm us instead. I wonder, where do you need to know calm that Jesus can bring today? And trust God for whatever form that may take this Christmas. You see, Jesus is Emmanuel, which means God with us. So may we know this truth this Christmas time. May we hold on to this truth this Christmas time. And may we live in the reality of this truth this Christmas time. Well, can I encourage you, before you finish this morning, to listen to the song Emmanuel by someone called Michael Card. The link should be in the text just below this video. And just use that as a way of reflecting on these words today. Thank you.